Hello and welcome to this online class on Jim Crow America. This is the second topic of History D, the first topic being the Reconstruction period, which, as you know, is the topic of the Cambridge Unit 3 assessment. Okay, today in this class we're going to focus on a few things that are related to the experience of black people post-Reconstruction. Therefore, we are looking at the time frame roughly from 1877 onwards. Most of you should have a good understanding or a fair understanding of the period immediately after the Civil War, when African Americans went through this process of improvement in their lives, although this improvement proved to be short-lived. And this period of improvement followed by examples and experiences of real significant challenges and eventually segregation and racism. We refer to it as the Reconstruction period, and the Reconstruction period really ends on a sour note with black people beginning to see that the writing was on the wall and that all the progress that they made during the Reconstruction period was starting to erode. So today we're going to pick this story up by looking at what we call Jim Crow America. In this kind of two-lecture topic, we're going to look at the following things: Jim Crow laws, rules, practices, some events, key legislation. That will cover most of today. Then in the next online lecture I will focus on points 2, 3 and 4. So what was African American experiences once we get into the 20th century. Let's begin with Jim Crow and what do we mean by Jim Crow? What did the term itself mean? Here is a stereotypical white produced image of Jim Crow. It's a racist stereotype, obviously. This is a white view of someone in the black community who was deemed to be inferior, ignorant and foolish, and therefore was depicted in such a way during the slave era. And this name given to this fictional figure, Jim Crow, the origins of it are not necessarily known. Perhaps the word crow refers to as black as a crow, but there's no real knowledge as to the genesis of this term. But what Jim Crow comes to mean is, in one word, segregation. Whenever you hear the term Jim Crow, it means segregation. We'll come back to some of these points in a moment. We're going to begin today just by outlining a few things that are fundamental to our understanding of the Jim Crow era. They are white Southerners opposing all of the progress that blacks had made post Civil War, and the things that the white community, the white population, white politicians, white businessmen, white workers, what they were opposed to was obviously the social and economic and political progress that African Americans had made. So the Southern challenge to the 14th Amendment is a big part of the Jim Crow era. This is when obviously the civil rights legislation, or the amendment to the Constitution that allowed for blacks to have equal citizenship with whites, when that is not accepted by white people, we start to see challenges to it, and ultimately that will end in segregation or Jim Crow. We will also see a concerted effort to remove black people from the franchise, and in doing so remove black people from positions of political power. And when the attacks on the 14th and 15th Amendment were not quite maybe going the way that white Southerners would like them to go, then the third point on this list would come into play, and that is violence dealt out viciously against black people. We have already saw a glimpse of this violence during the Reconstruction era, when the Klan emerge, and when the Klan do their best to undermine Reconstruction. Well, once the Jim Crow era is in place, the Klan are reborn, and the Klan, but not just the Klan alone, white communities in general, the police force, respectable, so-called respectable members of the white communities, especially in rural areas, are responsible for a lot of the violence that is dished out towards blacks to keep black people in their place. Why Jim Crow? Here is our starting off point. Now, I should say that some of the points I'm going to discuss today are based around the documents booklet or sources that I would normally give you in class. These are on my city, so when you get an opportunity to do so, as you read through these slides, or when you listen to this this online lecture, it would be useful to download the sources as well. So they are just Jim Crow sources on my site under the Jim Crow online book. Okay, I've already mentioned that Reconstruction was a period of highs and lows. Some fairly big highs from the kind of late 1860s through to the kind of mid 1870s, but there were periods of lows. One of these examples came in 1865 itself with the Black Codes, and to some extent the Jim Crow era is just an extension of these Black Codes that were implemented in the aftermath of the 13th Amendment being passed. So, Jim Crow is one very long low. Does it begin in 1877 with the compromise that leads to the end of Reconstruction? Possibly, but it's not finalised, if you like, until 1896 with the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court ruling, which we'll get to in a moment. The years 1877 to, let's say, therefore 1897, they're a kind of 20-year period of blacks who had done fairly well or very well during the Reconstruction period, beginning to realise that they were in for a real tough time of things, and slowly but surely whites chip away at the benefits that blacks had achieved during the 1860s and 70s. And by the time we get to this Supreme Court ruling of 1896, the beginning of Jim Crow segregation is very much underway. So the question is, why? Why Jim Crow? Why was segregation so essential to the white population? I'm going to start by looking at information from the historian Leroy Bennett Jr. And Bennett's work in the source booklet on my city is a really useful introduction to Jim Crow. And I want to point to a couple of things from this this secondary source, and it's to this idea of Jim Crow and the origins of it that I'm going to start with. And the origins of it are written clearly here: to humiliate and control blacks. Racism changes over the course of time. The racism during the slave era is different than the racism that emerges during the Jim Crow era. Is one worse than the other? Well, that is up to you to decide for yourself. There's definitely more violence in the latter version, the Jim Crow period. So I want to go to what I've referred to as source 1, which is on page 256 to 257. And I just want to point out that there were many forms of segregation imposed upon black people from really 1881 onwards. And this, as I said, goes on right up until the 1890s, when it's formalised, if you like, with the Supreme Court. But ultimately this segregation carries on up until the 1960s, when we have Martin Luther King appearing on the scene, or if you go back to the 50s with the Montgomery bus boycott. Then we start to see some attacks on segregation from the black community, more than from any other section of the American population. There is an argument that segregation still exists to this very day in the United States, but that's beyond what we have to focus on right now. What were the initial forms of segregation? Well, at the bottom of page 256, in an attempt to control and humiliate black people, segregation came in the form of white nurses not being able to treat black males, white teachers being forbidden to teach black students. In South Carolina, it was a crime for black and white cotton mill workers to look out of the same window. In Florida, there were Negro textbooks and there were white textbooks. In Oklahoma, there were separate but equal telephone booths. New Orleans segregated black and white prostitutes, and in Atlanta and Georgia, there were Jim Crow Bibles for black and white witnesses. So that's the level of segregation that will occur over the formative years of what we call Jim Crow. Many of these are implemented in the 1880s, even before the Supreme Court rules about the status of segregation in the United States. A few further lines down on the Bennett source, on 257, Bennett says, the thrust behind this system of segregation came from a variety of motives, including a desire to avoid assimilation and to limit or eliminate competition for scarce values. But there was always a desire amongst whites to discipline, control, punish, and humiliate. And that, to some extent, is the slave mentality, the white slave owner mentality that cannot quite accept that there has been a transformation in social relations in the southern states of the USA, that black people can think of themselves as being equal to whites, that black people can take on political positions similar to those of whites, that black people can set up their own plantations and work the land and be profitable in their work. That is very difficult for white people to accept. It's difficult for the white ruling class to accept, who have lost political power in some respects. It's very difficult for the white working class and for the poorest sections of white society, because blacks, free blacks, are now a competitor with them. During slavery, slaves, black people, were very much at the bottom of the social hierarchy. That was no longer quite the case. It will become the case again once Jim Crow is fully underway, but it wasn't quite the case in this period of Reconstruction and this period of limbo up until the 1890s. If I move on to the second point about segregation, there was also the view that black people, if they could be kept ignorant, would not be economic competitors. Therefore, they could be subjected to the most mundane manual forms of labour, such as sharecropping, where they could be exploited by white farmers. The key to this was obviously not just economic control of black people, but control of culture, and therefore trying to remove black people from the education system, or if you have to offer them education, make that education as inferior as possible. On page 257, we get examples of segregation or segregated methods when it comes to education. In the state of South Carolina in 1915, Bennett argues or states that there were roughly $14 spent on every white student, whereas for black students there was $2.57 spent. South Carolina was not alone in this unequal distribution of resources in education. In 1935 and 36, 10 southern states spent $49.30 for every white student, but only $17 for blacks. So here we are seeing blacks being ignored when it comes to their constitutional rights. And the reason that that is the case is because of a very important legal ruling that was known as the Plessy versus Ferguson case of 1896. All of this segregation that I've just referred to was allowed because of the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Constitution. So I'm going to focus on what we call the rejection of the 14th Amendment. Remember, if you've studied the Reconstruction era, you will be familiar with what we mean by the 14th Amendment. If you have not studied the Reconstruction period, the 14th Amendment was simply, along with the 1875 Civil Rights Act, the opportunity granted to all Americans, but obviously to ex-slaves, to accept that they were all equal. They had the same citizenship rights, therefore black people could go where they want, they could eat where they want, they could work where they want, they could live where they want. This was complete freedom and liberty. Now, as the period post 1877 compromise, when Reconstruction is deemed to come to an end, as that period starts to develop, black people slowly but surely across different states are denied their equal rights, and the 14th Amendment really comes to mean nothing for many of the southern states. So what we see is segregation at a state level, and segregation at a state level would have to be maybe accepted by black people, and some black people did accept it, but there were some who were unwilling to accept it, and some who wanted to argue that they were being denied their constitutional rights via this segregation. And one such individual who did stand up and speak out against the state segregation laws that eventually would become accepted across the entire South was Homer Plessy in 1892 in Louisiana. I'm just going to read a little bit to you regarding this case that you can see in the little cartoon strip. In 1892, the Citizens Committee, which was an early civil rights organisation in the state of Louisiana, they asked Homer Plessy if he would agree to violate Louisiana's separate car law, where black people sat in one part of the tram car and white people would sit in a different carriage. Plessy was asked to challenge this on June 7th, 1892. Plessy, at the age of 30, he had very light skin colour. In fact, he even claimed that he was 7/8 white. He decides to buy a first class ticket and sits in a white only carriage. When he does so, he is arrested, as you can see in this little cartoon, and eventually this case will go all the way to the Supreme Court. It starts off at local courts. At the local court, a judge, John Howard Ferguson, after hearing Plessy's case, accepts that the railroad company were okay to do as they had done. They had not denied Homer Plessy the right to travel, they had simply denied him the right to travel in a carriage with white people. But they believed that this was fair. This was what is referred to as separate but equal. Both carriages were arguably the same, and therefore Plessy's constitutional rights were not being denied. It would then go to the Supreme Court under the heading of Plessy versus Ferguson rights. This is Plessy challenging Judge Ferguson. And when it gets to the Supreme Court, with the exception of one lone dissenting voice, which was Justice John Marshall Harlan, every other Supreme Court judge accepted that what had went on in Louisiana was acceptable. This can be seen in your source 4. This ruling by the Supreme Court is really the ruling that allows for the establishment of Jim Crow across the entire South. If you look at source 4, you get a syllabus, a summary of the Plessy versus Ferguson case. It says the Statute of Louisiana Acts of 1890 requiring railway companies carrying passengers on their coaches in that state to provide equal but separate accommodations for the white and coloured races by providing 2 or more passenger coaches for each passenger train, or by dividing the passenger coaches by partition so as to secure separate accommodations. That is fine. There is nothing wrong with that whatsoever. Therefore, separate but equal was being upheld by the Supreme Court. The 14th Amendment was not about bringing the races together, it was about giving each race equal rights, and therefore Plessy was not being denied anything. He had the same rights as white people. From this point onwards, we get the beginnings of the period we call Jim Crow America, and the Supreme Court has sanctioned it. Okay, just to give you a little idea as to how this is going to spread across the South, the Plessy versus Ferguson case, once legitimated, would ensure segregation across all of these areas here. Some of these areas we will return to when we study the civil rights period, such as public transport and bus stations and restaurants and neighbourhoods. What this will ultimately mean is that black people being told that they cannot live their lives within white society unless they do so under white rules and regulations. And what I'm thinking about here is, it's okay when it comes to perhaps working. White people can allow black people to work on the same plantation as them, a little bit like the slave period. There's less desire there perhaps for clear segregation. But in all other walks of life, there is a black world and there is a white world. And you will know for yourself that this is not going to be two equal worlds, that the black experience is going to be nowhere near the same as the white experience, and therefore blacks are going to be disadvantaged and discriminated against as a result of the Plessy versus Ferguson case. Here are some of the most kind of famous pictures of segregation from waiting rooms for coloured or black being made clear so that passengers at bus stations knew exactly where they should sit or stand. The water coolers or water fountains are the most, again, probably well known of these examples of white and coloured, with quite often the white taps being slightly better standard than the African American facility. White hotels, black hotels, white neighbourhoods. This is the reality of the Plessy versus Ferguson case, and it will take until 1954 and then 1955 with the two landmark events for Plessy versus Ferguson to be struck down. We'll get to those events after Easter. At the moment I want to move away from the 14th Amendment and now get to the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment, as you will be aware if you study the Reconstruction era, is the amendment to the Constitution that gives black people the right to vote. However, once Jim Crow is in place, there is another area of black progress that starts to diminish, and it's diminished due to different methods deployed by white dominated states post 1877 that will try and ensure that white people will return to the positions that they once held, that they will become the political leaders at a national level, political leaders at state level, political leaders at a local level. Blacks will be removed from all positions, and the way to do that is obviously to stop blacks from voting in the first place. And there are a few different methods that were used to try and deny black people the right to vote, from poll taxes, making it very difficult for poor blacks to afford the opportunity to vote. You wouldn't want to keep white people from voting. You wouldn't want to keep poor whites who can't afford the poll tax from voting, so you could therefore implement things like a grandfather clause, which meant if your grandfather had the right to vote, then you could vote, and that was absolutely fine, because black people's grandfathers in the South, unless they were free men, did not have the right to vote, and therefore this would maybe allow some white people through. And then ultimately, if those grandfathers were still not able to vote or do not have the right to vote, you could then rely upon literacy tests, and literacy tests are what we can see in source 5. Now there's a few examples here, I'm only going to point out one or two of them. These are examples of just how cruel the Jim Crow system could be towards black people. Many blacks would want to hold on to the vote many blacks, when they have lost the right to vote in the South, will try their best to get it back, but they cannot do so unless they can pass literacy tests. These literacy tests are incredibly childish, actually, in some respects. The one I want to point out to you in source 5 is number 20 as a starting point, where in Louisiana the literacy test asked of black people, but also white people who were aiming to get the right to vote, to do little, quite often little kind of spelling activities. This first one says, spell backwards, comma, forwards. Now there is no correct answer to this test. If you're a white person and you complete it, then you might be absolutely fine. The decision made by the person in the town hall who grants the vote might agree to accepting your answer, but if you are black, the likelihood is that your answer is always going to be wrong. So spell backwards, comma, forwards, always had the potential to be incorrect. So if you were to write backwards with a comma, the answer might be, that's wrong. You should have written backwards, forwards, and you fail. Did you write backwards, forwards? That's wrong. You should have written backwards. So it's impossible really to pass these tests. The number 25 one says, write down on the line what you read in the triangle below, and if you wrote Paris in the spring, you might think that you have done what you've been asked to do, but the reality would be, no, you failed. What you should have wrote on that line was what you read in the triangle below, and so on and so forth. You can obviously work out with all these tests that there is always more than one answer, and therefore always an opportunity to deny black people the right to vote. Okay, let's look at the kind of final development during this period. Now, accept that both the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution being denied to black people are examples of racism, pure and simple. But there's another side to racism that I want to focus on, and it's the uglier side of racism. It's a kind of development, if you like, during the Jim Crow era. There had always been a view during the 200 or 300 years of slavery that black people were inferior to white people. And you're aware of some of these interpretations from your study of slavery, such as the Sambo slave, as depicted by Elkins. Black people, however, in spite of the view that they were inferior, were not seen as being different. They weren't seen as being, you know, so radically different from whites that they had to be segregated completely from whites. You will know that during the slave era, black and white often mixed, especially on smaller farms. Even in larger plantations, there was some mixing. Okay, it might have been at the will of white people, but toilets would have been shared, meals would have been shared, entertainment would have been shared between black and white. All of that is completely removed under the Jim Crow era. So we get a much more virulent, much more nasty, cruel form of racism. And this is, I suppose, best illustrated through lynching. Lynching is the real method of control from white people against black people during the Jim Crow era. So the next stage of this online lecture is going to focus on lynching. Okay, here we go. It might even be worthwhile thinking that this is a case study in some respects, because we're going to look at lynching, or you're going to look at lynching on the My City page by focusing on a few different examples of a few different kind of research methods as to how best to kind of study and understand lynching. Okay, we're going to start off with quantitative data and yeah, some statistics on the scale of lynching. Then we'll talk a little bit more about what lynching actually was. But you can see from this this table just how bad lynching was. There are total figures at the bottom. 4,743 people were lynched during the period 1882 to 1968. Now that might not seem like a massive number, but when you see how cruel lynching actually was, then you might start to get a sense of just how problematic this was for black people. White people were lynched as well. Some of these white people would have been Catholics and Jews, but more often than not, as you can see from these final statistics here, which were recorded by different black organisations such as the NAACP or the Tuskegee Institute, who we'll speak about in the next lecture. Most of these victims are black. You can see from a quick glance down the final column which states were more likely to carry out these atrocious violent attacks, and you'll see that I guess in some respects the most obvious culprits appear, and they are your states such as Mississippi with the highest amount, but also Louisiana and Georgia and Alabama and Texas. You might even notice that some of these locations where lynchings take place in the north, which was not completely immune from racism. In fact, the next lecture will focus more so on northern examples of racism and violence towards black people. I'm going to now move on to a little video clip. So we're kind of moving away from the quantitative, in fact we're jumping away from the quantitative to the qualitative. And I'm going to show you this little postcard video, and then I'll talk a little about it at the end. Some of the images here are pretty gruesome. I should probably warn you of that. If you have a weak disposition, you may not wish to watch this. But they are all postcard images. They're not moving images. So I'll play this and then we'll have a discussion about it afterwards.
He woke him out at night and entered the mother and son were hauled by wagon 6 miles west of
Greenville,
town.
Texas. The New York Times reported that the victims were tortured with knives before being
His
hanged.
charred corpse was hung for public display in front of a blacksmith.
Dead nigger. That riddled with bullets.
You did the work of men today, and your deeds will resound in every state, village, and hamlet.
I am a picker. It is my living and my avocation. I search out items that some people don't want or need, and then sell them to others who do. In America, everything is for sale, even a national shame. Until I came upon a postcard of a lynching, postcards seemed trivial to me, the way second-hand, misshapen Rubbermaid products might seem now. Ironically, the pursuit of these images has brought to me a great sense of purpose and personal satisfaction. Studying these photographs has engendered in me a caution of whites, of the majority, of the young, of religion, of the accepted. Perhaps a certain circumspection concerning these things was already in me, but surely not as actively as after the first sight of a brittle postcard of Leo Frank dead in an oak tree. It wasn't the corpse that bewildered me, as much as the canine thin faces of the pack, lingering in the woods, circling after the kill. Hundreds of flea markets later, a trader pulled me aside and in conspiratorial tones offered to sell me a real photo postcard. It was Laura Nelson, hanging from a bridge, caught so pitiful and tattered and beyond retrieving, like a paper kite snagged on a utility wire. That image of Laura layered a pall of grief over all my fears. I believe the photographer was more than a perceptive spectator at lynchings. Too often they compulsively composed silvery tableaux, nature morte, positioning and lighting corpses as if they were game birds shot on the wing. Indeed, the photographic art played as significant a role in the ritual as torture or souvenir grabbing. creating a sort of two-dimensional biblical swine, a receptacle for a collective sinful self. Lust propelled the commercial reproduction and distribution of the images, facilitating the endless replay of anguish. Even dead, the victims were without sanctuary. These photographs provoke a strong sense of denial in me and a desire to freeze my emotions. In time, I realize that my fear of the other is fear of myself. Then these portraits, torn from other family albums, become the portraits of my own family and of myself. And the faces of the living and the faces of the dead recur in me and in my daily life. I've seen John Richards alone on a remote county road, rocking along in hobby horse strides, head low, eyes to the ground, spotting coins or rocks or roots. And I've encountered Laura Nelson in a small, sturdy woman who answered my knock on a back porch door. In her deep-set eyes, I watched a silent crowd parade across a shiny steel bridge, looking down. And on Christmas Lane, just blocks from our home, I've observed another Leo, a small-framed boy with his shirt tail out and skullcap off-center, as he made his way to Sabbath prayers. With each encounter, I can't help thinking of these photos and the march of time and of the cold steel trigger in the human heart.